Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek, the animated series, seasons 1 and 2. This video is a part of a series of videos where I cover every episode of Star Trek, the original series, and now Star Trek, the animated series. One season at a time. In this video, I will cover the entirety of Star Trek the Animated Series, which takes place over season 1 and 2. So I had just covered the first 3 seasons of the original series, and I decided, hey, why not also include the animated series in with my coverage of the original series. Now, the animated series, of course, aired several years after the original series went off the air. I believe it aired in 1973 to 1974. But it was a direct response to the popularity that the original series was getting in syndication and in fan conventions and stuff. Although, I don't know, someone might correct me, the first fan convention might have taken place after the animated series, I don't really know. But anyway, there were producers at NBC who were quoted as saying that they thought that the Star Trek was a dud, was a failure, was a ratings bomb, but found out after they canceled it that this wasn't the case. There was this huge following for it, massive campaigns of letters, and huge spike in popularity and syndication. And so the 70s was an off and on trying to figure out how to bring Star Trek back, because they saw how popular it was. There were many ideas, doing another show, doing a movie, and this is one of the things they did do briefly for only a year and a bit. I'm not sure why exactly this show was canceled. I couldn't find any information on that. Maybe it wasn't, I don't know, it seems like it was significantly popular. Maybe the people involved just didn't want to do it anymore, or I don't know. But it did win some Emmys for like Best Kids Show. So it's it was seen good at the time. But of course, as we all know, the animated series didn't last long, and their attempts they were gonna make a Star Trek movie, like a B movie called something like Planet of the Titans or something like that was gonna come out in the mid-70s, but then that was scrapped, and they decided to do Star Trek Phase 2, another show that would come out in the late 70s, but then that was scrapped, and instead, after the success of Star Wars, instead they decided to do a major motion picture where they threw tons of money at and had a well-known director direct it, which turned out to be boring as hell and disappointed fans. And then, of course, they revived the franchise with Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, which was a much more crowd-pleasing, although not as didn't make as much money, but was much better received. So, you all know the history of Star Trek. But anyway, and then, of course, it would make more successful movies, which would lead to more spin-offs, which would lead to more spin-offs, which would lead to more movies and more spin-offs, and now it's a huge fucking thing. So, the 70s was kind of where all that desire to build Star Trek brand name and keep it going began, but it didn't actually go into fruition until the 80s and 90s. So we did get this one little brief part in the 70s, though. The 70s wasn't completely devoid of Star Trek. We have the animated series. Now, apparently in the 80s, when Gene Roddenberry was working on The Next Generation, he made the conscious decision to strike the animated series from canon, saying it is not canon. They didn't want to be beholden to some of the characters, events, and things that were shown in the animated series. The biggest contradiction being is that They had this room called the Rec Room, which could recreate any locale that they wanted to. So it was basically the holodeck, and that's probably the main reason why Gene Roddenberry is like, no, because the holodeck is a technology that came across that was made a century after the original series, therefore they wouldn't have this technology in that time period. Now, to be fair, the Rec Room wasn't the exact same thing as the holodeck, because the Rec Room seemed like it could only create locations, whereas the holodeck can create interactive people. But still, and then I think Star Trek Discovery also showed something that could recreate locations as well. But then, alright, Discoveries, you're getting into the newer Star Trek, because when CBS completely took over the Star Trek franchise, or at least the television portion of it, in the mid-2000s, when it bought out Viacom, or merge, or whatever the hell happened, they decided to make the animated series canon again, and then that became an official thing going forward. In fact, I remember getting into arguments with people online where I said, well, the animated series isn't canon, so who cares? They're like, actually it is canon, because CBS and the studio that owns Star Trek now wanted to make more money off of it. So they're like, no, this is canon again, because we want people to watch it and we want to make more money off of it. And so it was added to all the streaming services like Netflix and stuff that was on. And of course, now the Star Trek franchise is pretty localized on Paramount Plus, because Paramount wanted to hold the reins to it, and it showcases the animated series as one of the main Star Trek shows. And so it's the studios trying really hard to present the animated series as full canon and just as worthy as any other Star Trek show. Which, growing up in the 90s, the animated series was considered less than. It was considered similar than, like, say, the Star Trek books, or video games, or comic books, stuff that is definitely not canon. But now all of a sudden, well, not all of a sudden, it happened like 20 years or 15 years ago, but still, in the mid-2000s, just because the studio was greedy, wanted to make money, now it's considered canon again. Now, do I consider this canon? Yes and no. Like, I don't care. That is my ultimate conclusion. I don't care. Because there were definitely things, that, especially about the episode Yesteryear, which a lot of Trek did consider canon. There were references to it throughout Deep Space Nine. Voyager and Enterprise, of course, heavily referenced that episode Yesteryear, with specific locations and Salox and all those other things. But then the newer Star Trek shows, once, officially animated series is canon, reference the hell out of the animated series. So they start to treat it fully as canon. There's a line in Picard that references this race. I can't even remember how they're pronounced, but it's a silly tiger race that I'll get to that episode. It sucks. Or the race sucks anyway. And Riker reference them, and Picard is, we get problems from that race. And Star Trek Lower Decks references the hell out of the animated series. They have a lot of the same aliens pop up. Mainly because it's the next animated series in the Star Trek franchise, so they want to recognize their roots, the other animated series. And so, yeah, is it canon? Sure. I also remember getting an argument once when I said this, that the first time the Klingon ships has been shown to have cloaking technology was Star Trek 3, The Wrath of Khan. Not The Wrath of Khan, The Search for Spock. And they were like, the first time was actually the animated series, but nice try, idiot. And I'm like, well, that's if you consider the animated series canon, and a lot of people don't. But anyway, that was all kind of beside the point of my point of that whole post. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that. So, I don't know. I don't really care if it's canon or not. That's my ultimate conclusion. However, you know what? When I was decided to cover it for my channel, because I've gone through every Star Trek series doing these season by season reviews where I cover every episode of a season, and I thought it made the most sense for me to lump the animated series in with the original series, because I don't really see this as its own separate show the way that TNG is its own separate show, or Deep Space Nine is its own separate show, because it's basically just an extension of the original series. It has the same characters, it has many of the same writers. In fact, a lot of the scripts in the animated series were originally written for the original series. They were supposed to be in the season 4 of the original series, which of course never happened. So I kind of see this as a surrogate. So if I am going to consider it canon, I'm more of consider it the season 4 of the original series that we never really got, rather than its own separate show. I don't really see it as that, even though of course it's animated and the style of it is very different than the original series. It's still, I don't know, I still look at it more, I look at it as a more legitimate extension of the original series than, say, the books. Like, the books is kind of, that's like B canon, it's not really canon. Whereas the animated series is a step up from the books, but a step down from the shows. That's how I look at it. So if other shows want to reference it and bring it into canon, sure. If they want to ignore other parts, like the holodeck existing 100 years before it was supposed to, and ignore parts like that, fine. Ignore that's not canon, but other parts are canon. I'm fine with that. I don't really care. But yes, I do see this as less legitimate than the shows, but more legitimate and stuff like the books and comic books and video games. Anyway, as for what I thought of the animated series, I haven't seen many shows, cartoon animated shows from the 70s. I mean, I did watch a lot when I was a kid growing up in the 80s, but I don't really remember much. And kind of beside the point, but I recently went back and watched episodes of He-Man, and my God, it looks so cheesy and outdated. And I was like, I can't believe I actually watched and enjoyed this when I was a kid. Like, couldn't I just see how fucking cheesy this was? But of course, I didn't realize how bad the 80s were. But point is, I've heard from people who are familiar with animated shows from the 70s that this animation is considered bad even for the time. That the studio that did this was considered kind of a lesser studio that made lesser animated shows. And I kind of get that, because it is a bit... It has a different style than the original series, because the characters come off as more stilted, which is funny because it's called the animated series, yet they're more like... They were more animated or more like active or brought to life in the original series, where here they're kind of just like, they do a lot of eye movements like this, and they're just Mr. Spock, and they move their eyes around. And because I guess they were limited with the animation was so bad, it couldn't have them move that much, so they're mainly just like sitting there like talking like, Mr. Spock, blah 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 blah. So it's a lot of like exposition. It's more exposition heavy than the original series was, and less interactive. It's more of characters just sitting there, and there's a lot more technobabble involved in too, which may have set the stage for all the technobabble that was eventually used in Next Generation and Voyager. But yeah, it's mainly just characters, and it's funny because this is supposed to be a kids show, yet it was more like heady and less sort of action orientated than the original series, which you think it would be the other way around. But yeah, it mostly involves characters sitting there going, Mr. Spock, blah blah blah. And it's funny, whenever they move, they show characters, especially if they run or something exciting, they do the same shot of them. You see their elbows doing this, and it looks very unnatural. So it's not very good animation. But that being said, it it is able to do a lot more with world building and having strange aliens than the original series was, because the original series was limited by its budget and what it could do in practical terms, where the animated series has a lot more weird looking aliens, weird looking landscapes, and does stories like where they go underwater and have an underwater city in the underwater aliens, something they could never do without it looking like total shite in the original series. And they have a lot of like giant monsters and all that, and it had like, aliens, weird, as I said, aliens that have not been replicated in real life form but have been recreated for lower decks, because that is also an animated show. And so aliens like the BIM alien, he could as they call him a colony alien, he could split himself into three pieces. They had another showed another member of that species in lower decks, and also like a Rex, who became a main cast member on the animated series. That alien wasn't seen again until lower decks again, and then they had that bird alien guy in that one episode. So stuff like that the original series really couldn't do. But on the other hand, it kept using the same bad sound effects. There were multiple episodes where they had these giant pterodactyl creatures attacking from above, and they always were different, but they appeared in several episodes, and they used the same annoying repetitive bird sound effect where it goes, and it's grating on the nerves. And then they also have a giant monster, and they use the same exact sound effect for the giant monster. So point is, in some ways it can expand upon the original series what they could do, but in many other ways it was even just as cheesy, if not more so. Yeah, particularly the whole stilted way and everyone just moves their eyes around. But anyway, so there's no episode of the animated series that I think is absolutely great. I am going to do a top 30 where I'm going to take episodes from the original series and the animated series. And you'll note that a lot of the animated series episodes are not going to make it as high as the original series, because I don't think there is one that is as good as the really good ones. The best that the episodes have gotten out of ratings between 1 and 10, 10 being the best, is an 8. That's the highest. There were several 8s, to be fair, but that's the highest it got. So yeah, my opinion of the animated series is a little bit lower, as I said, than any of the other TV shows. But anyway, let me go ahead and jump into the episodes of the animated series. So we'll start with the first episode, Beyond the Furthest Star. Now this is kind of what I think about. This episode kind of exemplifies the animated series in my mind. That is kind of not terrible, but kind of boring, because they discover this weird spaceship, and again, it looks unique and something, a design that the original series would never be able to do, but they just have a lot of technobabble talk where they're sitting there, it's a ship, Captain, and and they don't really do much. They go on board, and some aliens, weird animals, go gets out and attacks them, and then this weird entity gets on board the ship and laughs and go and tries to take it over. Yeah, so it's fine. It's okay. It's really forgettable, but it's not terrible. One thing I will mention though is that they had the original cast members come back, all except for Chekhov, which I think I heard that they only wanted to bring back the big three, the Kirk, Spock, and McCoy at first, but Leonard Nimoy was insistent they bring back other characters other actors like George Takei and Michelle Nichols, but I guess he wasn't able to bring. I don't know. I heard different things of why Walter Koenig didn't. I heard that he didn't want to do it, or I heard that they never offered it to him. I don't know. But anyway, so they didn't have Chekhov, but they had the main cast members. But the problem is, they're doing all the voices for all of them, and they try to get James Doohan and Nigel Barrett returns for Nurse Chapel, and she and Michelle Nichols share all the female voices, and you can absolutely tell that it's then all the guest women all sound like Nurse Chapel or Michelle Nichols. So yeah, they're not professional animated voice actors, so they're not the best. Apparently there is this one dude who is part of the Filmation studio who did lend voices for some of them occasionally, but yeah, that's another issue with the show. Is very limited in the voice acting, and I was just thinking about that because the evil voice of the evil computer, I think, was like James Doohan trying to do her. It just does not sound good. Alright, so the next episode is Yesteryear, and this is considered to be one of the best show episodes. As I said, this is the one that's most referenced because it explores Vulcan history and explores Spock's backstory, and so it was even before the animated series was considered canon. This episode always was, and I can see that. Like, I can see it's a really good episode. Now, I've also heard the opinion that it's not a good episode because the time travel logic sucks and doesn't make any sense, which is true. The time travel logic is kind of nonsensical because, alright, so Kirk and Spock are in the Guardian Forever, and yeah, the fact that they're just casually using the Guardian Forever for historical research reminds me of like that episode of Simon Earth when Enterprise went back to the 20th century for historical research, hence, in other words, for no good fucking reason. Although this maybe isn't quite as bad as that, but it's still along the same lines as why would you just sit there and fuck with the Guardian forever? Seems like it wouldn't be a safe thing to do. But anyway, Kirk and Spock are in the past of some other planet, I think Orion, and they come back and all of a sudden Spock doesn't exist and there's an Andorian first officer that takes his place and no one's ever heard of Spock, and they do some research and they find out that Spock had died when he was a kid, and they did some further research saying that because Spock as a kid remembers being saved by his cousin, but then he starts to recall that his cousin looked exactly the way he does now, meaning that Spock had traveled back in time and saved a young Spock's life, and without him doing that, then Spock would have died as a kid. And they said, oh, because since you were in Orion's past, you weren't able to go back, and you never existed, and so you weren't able to go back and save your young self. And so that leads him to go back into his past and save his young self. But that makes no fucking sense. Like, why? Because it's the whole timeline being changed that led to him going back in the past to save his younger self. And so if he never had that motivation in the first place, he never would have saved his younger self. But so how was he alive as an adult? It doesn't make any sense. But I actually don't care that much. Usually time travel flunkies like that, especially if it like attacks the whole premise of the episode, usually irritates me. But I'm more or less willing to let that go because it's a good character story. I mean, I just feel like, and I think it is because it's an animated series. I'm more willing to be like, yeah, that premise is nonsense, but whatever. Because with cartoons, I'm more willing to just go with it. It was a really great character story, seeing Spock as a kid and seeing the older Spock interact with his younger version of his father, you know, it was actually sad when young Spock's Salat died. I was crying. So it was. Yeah, it was a good character story, and plus it was even though the time travel logic was nonsensical, it was still intriguing that there was an Andorian first officer instead of Spock, and there was a history that they had to go restore. Um, so I do like this episode. I don't think it is like amazing or one of the best. I wouldn't put this up with the best of the original series, but it was interesting. It was a good character story. Anyway, we'll go ahead and get into the next episode, which is one of our planets is missing. And I remember when I covered this episode before, I was just upset about the misleading title, because that makes it sound like something goofy, like something like a silly comedy, like, uh-oh, where'd our planet go? Was it over there? But it's actually like a really serious episode about this giant cloud that fucking destroys planets and eats them up, and this whole, populated planet of the Federation colony is about to be destroyed by this freaking thing, and so the Enterprise has to fly into the cloud to, try to stop it. Now, I had criticized Star Trek The Motion Picture, which, again, there's this drive from people, especially hipsters, to try to act like it's a really great movie, and it's actually really good, but it's not. I'm sorry, it's a total disaster. And I talked before about how The Motion Picture was essentially just the episode The Changeling. In fact, a lot of people refer to it as Where Nomad Had Gone Before, which I like. I think that's clever, because Nomad being the, android from a robot from the Changeling, because the motion picture really emulated it. But watching this episode, I realized that the motion picture actually emulates two episodes, The Changeling and this one, because this one was also very similar to the motion picture, watching it, because it's about the Enterprise flying inside a cloud that's destroying planets, and so they had to do it. In this case, it's to save some random Federation colony, in the motion picture's Earth, but either way, they're doing it to save a planet from other destruction. They had to fly inside a cloud, and you get all these cool shots of, the Enterprise flying in a cloud, and it's a huge, massive cloud, and it has all these different chambers and shit that it has to fly around, and I was like, yeah, that's just like the motion picture. So they just basically just took The Changeling in this and made it into a movie. Why it sucks. There's nothing there. It's all fluff. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about that boring. Oh my god, it's so boring. Disaster. I'm here to talk about this episode, which, again, is kind of, it's silly. It's like it's at first it's like really heavy, because Kirk is talking to this governor of the Federation colony who he knows, and it's like, oh, we're trying to evacuate, but not everyone's gonna make it out. We're all gonna die. It's talking about the death of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and that's pretty heady. That's pretty serious stuff for a kids show, if I may say. Anyway, but then they go inside a cloud, and they like have this really bad animated map of it, and they're saying, oh, we're now inside the thing, and they get to finally like communicate, where Spock does a Vulcan mind meld with, just like he did with V'ger, by the way, but anyway, he does a Vulcan mind meld with the cloud, and it's like, what, who, I think it's Nichelle Nichols again that does the voice, why are you talking, what is it, like that interaction, that dialogue between the cloud creature and Spock was just so terrible. It was so horrendous. I was just like, all right, enough of this. And she's like, oh, I didn't realize you were actually people, so I'm not gonna eat you now. You're good. It's kind of boring. So, again, this episode wasn't absolutely terrible. At least it didn't last 2.5 hours long and have gratuitous 15-minute shots of the fucking cloud, and when Kirk and Scotty flying around the Enterprise for 10 goddamn minutes looking at it. But anyway, so not as painful to watch as the motion picture, but still not that good of an episode. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into the next episode, which is the Lalaurie Signal. Now, I did really enjoy this episode. It's Not because it does show one of the advantages that the animated series has over the original series is I think some movement for women's rights have probably improved in the 4 or 5 years in between the two shows, because the way they treat women is very different than the way the original series did. They're more, I mean, they're still in short skirts, but they're more uh, intelligent, more in command, rather than as simply as, set dressing, going, "Oh, little old me." And in particular, and this isn't the only episode in the animated series, Uhura takes command of the Enterprise. That is something that never happened in the original series, and I actually kind of love that. And Uhura is actually, overall in the animated series, is a much more, so shown as a much more competent and much more good Starfleet officer, and is much more prominent and has more of a character. And in this episode, it's very similar to the Voyager episode Favorite Son, which a lot of people seem to absolutely hate, which I don't actually think is that bad, to be honest, but it's very similar, where a group of women lure men into the planet under, oh, look at how we're pretty sexy women, but once they're there, they kill them and drain their energy. And it's similar that way, because you have all these beautiful women that lure all the men of the Enterprise to this planet so they can just suck the energy out of them. But however, I like this one better than Favorite Son, because they do something that makes the men all goofy. It's not just they're like, ooh, pretty ladies. That it actually makes them lose, makes them like drunk or whatever. It like controls them, but none of the women are affected, and so essentially the women have to take command of the Enterprise. And even like Scotty is like, oh, little Lawson. He's acting all silly when he's on the ship, so Uhura has to take command, and they have to put all the women in charge, and the women beam down with the all-female security team, and like just shoot all the women who are trying to trap the men. I kind of like that. I think that's cool, because that's definitely something that the original series wouldn't do. But mainly, I like how Uhura takes command and how she's seen as a very competent character. But of course, Spock is a Vulcan, so he's never affected by anything. I mean, he's kind of affected, but not as bad as the other men. So he's able to help and break free and help Uhura beam down and shit like that. But and in the background of how, at the end of the episode, the women who tried to kill all the men are just like, oh, we now see the errors of their ways, and Uhura's gonna have the Federation bring them to another planet where they won't have to like suck the energy of men in order to live. And they're like, oh, thank you for this. That's all a bit too lovey-dovey and nice of an ending. That like they literally almost like sucked all the energy and killed fucking Kirk and all the other men. That's all they get. But anyway, I actually really like this episode. So then we'll move over to the next episode, which is more Tribbles, more Troubles. Now, this is the one of the episodes I know for sure was based off a script that was supposed to be in season 4 of the original series, which of course never happened because the Tribbles were so popular. They wanted to bring them back, and they brought them back for this episode. And I don't hate Tribbles. I just think they're so overrated. Like, I don't really care that much about them. And I just, bringing back Cyrano Jones and having him act like, oh, Captain Friend, Captain. And like, I hate that character, and I hate that type of thing. And I didn't really find it interesting. And this time the gag was the Tribbles, instead of breeding uncontrollably, because Cyrano Jones promised to get that under control, but instead they just grew huge. They just grew bigger. So instead of having Tribbles everywhere, you had giant Tribbles around the ship. That's dumb. Now, I did kind of like this episode because the Federation got into or the Enterprise, I should say, got into sort of a battle of wits with the Klingon ship. I believe it was Koloth. They brought the same Klingon back. My dear Captain Kirk. But this time, of course, it was just James doing a terrible voice for him. But anyway, I think they actually got the actor who played Serenade Jones to come back as a guest for this. But anyway, they had James doing a terrible voice for Koloth. And they got into a battle of wits with them, and I kind of like that. I mean, the Klingon ship had this like new super weapon that was like draining the Enterprise, but Kirk was like finding out tactical ways to overcome it. Like that part of the episode, I actually did enjoy. But then, like, I just think the comedy. Like, I talked about in the original series how I don't really like the comedy of the original series. I don't find 60s humor funny. This was worse because this was kids' 60s humor, or you could say 70s humor, but just as bad as my opinion. Anyway, this was the kids' version of that. Yeah, it's funny because there are some moments of the animated series I thought were actually funny, which I'll talk about later. But they were massively trying to be funny, but I think what also hurt it was not only was it like the humor was like more of kids humor, so not as good, but it also really hurt the delivery. It was so flat because, as I said, the performances of these animated characters are so stilted. There's just like, oh Scott, oh, and it's a stilted delivery of lines that are supposed to be funny, so they're not. But the music is telling you obviously that it should be funny and really over the top in obvious ways, going dun 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 dun. Like, trying to see laugh, it's funny, but it's not fucking funny. It's not funny. It's just cheesy and stupid. But anyway, as I said, I kind of like the Klingons tactical stuff they did in this episode. So not a terrible episode, but okay. Anyway, let's go ahead and move over to the next episode, which is The Survivor. Now, I surprisingly really like this episode. In fact, I looked up reception on this episode, and apparently it's not received very well. A lot of people didn't like it that much and thought it was just okay. Again, I don't think any episode of the animated series is amazing, but this is one of the better ones of the animated series, in my opinion. I haven't confirmed this, but this one did feel like it was based off of a script for the original series because it felt very complex and adult. So it's about the Enterprise discovering this, famous philanthropist. I can never say that fucking word. Someone who's very generous and has a lot of money or gives his time to charities and whatnot. But anyway, they discover him. They thought he was dead. He's still alive, and his fiance just so happens to be on the Enterprise. But he breaks up with her immediately, saying they're not the same. And then all this weird shit happens. You find out that it's actually this weird shape-shifting alien, who I think did actually appear later in Lower Decks, who was working for the Romulans in order to sabotage the Enterprise and get them to go into the neutral zone so the Romulans can destroy them for legitimate reasons. And he, like, this alien takes the form of Kirk, whatever, but then they, the crew work together to try to uncover the conspiracy, and they're able to. The alien apparently was coerced by the Romulans, and so they're able to convince him to stop working for the Romulans, and he helps them get out of the situation. And he has some really like emotional, complex scenes between this alien pretending to be that rich dude and the fiance, and you had the moments of the fiance not understanding what was going on, but finding out that her fiance was actually dead, and this was just someone emulating him. But she was, had this encounter where she was gonna kill this creature for doing it, and decided not to, and instead they kind of end up on good terms, and it was actually I think is way more emotionally complex for a kid show, and that's why I think it was based off of an original series script. Although I don't know that for sure, but I liked it. I thought it was done very well. It was one of the fresh breaths of air in the animated series that wasn't just a goofy cartoon. Although the character Winston, whatever his name was voiced extremely badly by William Shatner, and it was really hard for me to get over that fact. William Shatner can't fucking act. I'm sorry, and then trying to do a different voice on that was just terrible, but still good script. Anyway, let's go ahead and move over to the next episode, which is the Infinite Vulcan. Now, apparently, this episode is notorious for being just as terrible as Spock's brain. I don't think it's that bad, but it's definitely not good. So it's about the away team go to this planet, and there's this giant alien who steals Spock and makes a giant clone of Spock. So there's like a huge clone of Spock, and I don't know. And there's just like these weird plane aliens on the planet, and this also has those generic like pterodactyl things that go and try to attack the crew. I don't know. It's just a big ball of nonsense. I don't think this is the worst thing ever. Like a lot of people say, this is like absolute schlock, one of the worst things the Star Trek franchise has ever done. I don't think it's that bad, but it's definitely just a giant mess that I don't give a crap about one way or the other. So, next episode is The Magics of Omega 2, and this episode is absolutely terrible. It is horrible. It is garbage. It is. So, they go to this planet where they meet this alien named Lucius, I think his name is, whatever. Anyway, he's like this, has like deer legs or something and like horns, and he does all this magic, and he's like, oh, and he's all silly, and then the crew find they can do magic too if they just think hard enough. And in fact, we get this stupid scene with Spock trying to be all logical. Oh, logic dictates if I just think this thing will happen with my mind, I can move it, and his hands start glowing, going woo woo. Anyway, the other people on the planet discover them and capture them and put them on trial, because apparently these magical beings all visited Earth years ago, because of course they have, and they were persecuted at the Salem witch trials, so they recreate the Salem witch trials for Kirk and his crew and put them on trial. And they're so dumb. Everything about this episode is absolutely ridiculous, nonsensical. It's just crazy, like bright visuals of magic can happen. Just think magical thoughts can happen. They try to rationalize it with BS of this is a different realm of the universe that allows the magic to happen, and these being, I don't know. It is garbage, absolute pure garbage. Anyway, we got a string of bad episodes here, because the next episode is Once Upon a Planet, which is a sequel to Shore Leave, an episode I never liked. I always hated this episode, even though some people really like it. I never did it. I covered that one in the original series already, but we don't need a sequel to it, and the sequel is even worse. It has they go to the planet knowing it's a pleasure planet this time, but then all the robots there try to kill them, because the supercomputer controls it goes crazy, like supercomputers do, and it's again, it's even worse than the first one. Absolutely horrible, no redeeming qualities. Next episode is Mud's passion, because we keep with the theme of having these terrible episodes that have a whole bunch in a row. So we get Harry Mudd again. Oh, for joy. I absolutely cannot stand Harry Mudd. And what I think is probably his worst appearance ever, and that's saying a lot, saying how much I don't like this character. He tries to sell these love potion crystals that make people fall instantly in love with you. And they happen to work. Now here's the thing though. When I did my top 10 best and top 5 worst episodes of the animated series, I named this episode the worst episode of the entire show. And to be fair, I changed my mind about that when watching this episode. I still hate this episode. I still think it's terrible, but my opinion of it raised slightly because there were a couple moments in this episode I genuinely thought were funny. Now, it is still a terrible episode. It has completely character assassinates, absolutely destroys Christine Chapel, that has her actually buy these crystals from Harry Mudd so she can use them on Spock, which she would never do. Like, no crew member of the Enterprise would ever buy into this love potion that would force somebody to fall in love with them against their will, against their consent. They would not do that. Christine would not do that. I know she's had a thing for Spock, but she wouldn't want to do this in an artificial way where Spock is like, oh, Christine. And she falls for Harry Mudd, and Harry Mudd gets the better of her and takes her to this planet where we have this giant creature, generic alien huge creature going, and Kirk and Spock have to beam down to stop them. And then the whole crew gets infected with the crystals when they break up and go into the air system, and they all start acting goofy and falling in love with each other. Now, this is where the element what I actually think is funny comes in, because we had this scene where they're on the bridge after Harry Mudd had abducted Nurse Chapel, and Spock, is being affected by the love potion, and he's like, oh, we have to get Christine because I love her. And as soon as he says that, like, they show like reaction shots of all the crew going, of course it's just the animated thing, so it's very stilted. We're like kind of looking at each other like, what? He just said he loved her. And then so it snaps to a bunch of different people. It goes Kirk, Scotty, Uhura, and then it goes to Rex, and he just goes, woo! And I thought that was the funniest thing ever, because everyone else is just going like, and then all of a sudden Rex just goes, woo! Now Rex is one of the two characters, and then we also get Rex, who's the other character, two characters that they invented for the animated series as main cast members. Rex is to replace Chekhov, because as I said, Chekhov isn't in this, and Rex is, I guess, for the episodes where they couldn't get Nichelle Nichols, so they don't have a horror, so they have the cat lady, Cation or whatever, who they actually became a main cast member in Star Trek Lower Decks, a member of that species, that and also appeared in several of the Star Trek movies, Star Trek 4 and Star Trek 5. So we have seen this species in live action. I think they're called Cations, but anyway, I like these two characters. And Rex is voiced by Majel Barrett, because she voices all the female characters, and then there's Rex, I think, is voiced by James Doohan. But anyway, so they don't usually do much. Like, and Rex tries to have this cat-like voice, like purring. It's kind of silly, but I like that moment with the Rex where he just goes woo for no reason. I don't know, and I was trying to classify as this is so bad as good humor, because I'm not laughing. I'm kind of laughing at the episode, but on the other hand, this is not unintentional humor, because that scene was intended to be funny. That's the purpose of the scene, is to be funny, and I found it funny, although I've mainly found it funny because of how stupid it is, which maybe not be what they were going for, but still, I don't know if I can call it unintentional humor, because it was intended to be funny. I just find it funny maybe for different reasons than what was intended. I don't know. And then, so the other scene I find kind of funny is when, actually, several things, like when the Enterprise crew get affected by the love potion, they're all acting crazy, and we get a shot of, like, the Enterprise floating in space, and Scotty, the audio you hear Scotty singing, like, shanties, and going, hold me to love. I thought that was fucking hilarious. Again, kind of laughing at the episode rather than with it, but still, it was intended to be funny. And then the other moment that I got a huge chuckle out of is when, like, Kirk, Spock, and Nurse Chapel and Harry Mudd are, like, being hunted by these giant animal, crazy monsters going "Rrr, rrr," with that stupid sound effect being used over and over again. They call up to the Enterprise to be beamed up. They're like, beam us to the transporter room, beam us aboard. And in the transporter room is just two crew members, like a man and a woman, dancing to music and just ignoring them and going, oh, la, la. For some reason, I thought that was hilarious. They're about to be killed, and they try to beam aboard, and they're just like doing a waltz or a dance in the fucking transporter room. Again, it was intended to be funny, but I'm kind of laughing at how stupid it is. But I find it funny, and it was intended to be. And then just the whole way that the whole crew is acting crazy, like they had the Emmerich character going to Scotty. It's like, oh, I find you attractive. I don't know. It's so stupid that's kind of funny, but don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this is why I like the episode, because I don't. I don't like this episode. I think it's a terrible episode. I think it's crap, but not the worst episode of the show. Those moments, even I am kind of laughing about how dumb it is. They tried to be funny, and they are funny, so I gotta give this episode a tinge of credit. So I can't call it the worst episode of the show, but it's still an absolute terrible. It is a terrible piece of crap. Definitely the worst Harry Mudd episode. Not saying a lot because I can't stand Harry Mudd. So there we go. Anyway, let's move over to the next episode, which is the Territon incident. Finally getting away from the crap, because this episode is pretty good. I mean, it's okay. So this is basically, it's a concept episode where the crew starts shrinking and getting smaller. But it actually has a kind of interesting story around it, because they go to answer a distress call from this planet, and this weird thing happens to the ship that makes them smaller, and they're kind of shrinking and having to use the instruments. And Kirk beams down, and the transporter makes him, solves the problem, makes him bigger again. But all of his crew is tiny, and some have been abducted to the planet. And we find out that this planet was originally colonized by humans centuries ago, and it was lost because something of the effects of this world caused the people to shrink, and the colony get so tiny that they lost contact with the rest of humanity. And they're asked to be saved by Kirk, and who eventually saves. Although, some of the way, like the way that dude on the colony talked, like, it was nonsensical, because Kirk, because he thought that they were attacking the ship and making it people so small and they'd eventually become microscopic and wouldn't be able to use the instruments, so essentially killing them. So Kirk threatens to destroy the city unless they stop their attack, and his response should have been something along the lines of, "Oh, we'll stop. We're stopping right now. We just wanted to make you small enough so we could bring members of your crew here so we could negotiate because we need help. We couldn't communicate with you that way. We're just trying to make you communicate. We'll restore your ship. Everything will be fine." But instead of saying anything of the kind, the guy responds by saying, "I forbid you to destroy me." Why the fuck would you say that? What sense? That just serves to antagonize him. And indeed, Kirk's response to that was, "You forbid me? Bitch, please. I got this ship. I can just destroy you whenever I want." So that was kind of a dumb response from that guy. But, it was still a fun episode, and it was a good concept episode. I enjoyed it. The plot made sense, so, made out in the end. So it was decent. Anyway, let's go ahead and move over to the next episode, which is the Time Trap. Now, this is your standard, Bermuda Triangle episode, which was very popular. I remember seeing this in a lot of cartoon shows when I was a kid, so it was very popular in the 70s, the 80s, for every cartoon show had to have a Bermuda Triangle themed episode, and so it makes sense that they would do this in Star Trek as well, especially for a cartoon version of it. And they call it the Delta Triangle. They're not being very metaphorical here. Or very secretive of exactly what they're doing. But it turns out it snatches them, and they go into this realm where a lot of these ships have been stuck there for centuries, and apparently they grow a lot older, and so they formed their own society, and they have their own government, and they're very pacifist, and they're made up of all these different alien species from across the galaxy, and they've all come together to form this very peaceful society. But they're convinced, of course, that you can never leave. You can check out every time you want, but you can never leave. And they're stuck there forever, and they think Kirk is wasting his time by trying to get out. And then he teams up with, I believe this time it's, not Koloth, not King, but what's the other Klingon guy? Kor. There it is, Kor. And I believe, again, voiced by James Doohan. So it's Kor's second appearance. And, but of course, Kor just wants to destroy the Enterprise, and they're teaming up with them, but they intend to destroy them. It reminds me a lot of that Voyager episode, The Void, but not as good. I think The Void was actually much better. Here is kind of like those people in society kind of being on their high horse and moralizing, but then they're too stupid to get out, where Kirk and Kor can get out if they work together, but they work together. Kor, of course, is being evil and twisting his mustache and trying to destroy the Enterprise at every chance he gets, and Kirk, of course, eventually, catches on to the mustache twirling and stops him from doing it, and they get out. So it's a decent episode. Again, I'm not blown away by it. I don't think it's anything spectacular, but it's good. Anyway, we'll go ahead and get into the next episode, which is the ambiguous element. I don't know, however you pronounce that. It's one with the fish people. It's the one I was talking about, where they go to this underworld world where there's these people who are, water breathers, and they turned Spock and Kirk into water breathers because they got attacked by another generic giant monster going with those steams. It's a terrible sound effect. Anyway, and then Kirk and Spock don't want to live the rest of their lives in a water tank, so they try to beam back down to the planet and go to the underworld city to figure out, hey, turn us back into air breathers. But apparently it was the young people who helped them. The older people are very racist against air breathers and try to kill them and blah 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 blah. I remember this is one of the episodes because when I was a teenager in the 90s, I didn't have access to the animated series. It wasn't on television or anything I could access. There were no streaming services or not even DVDs. We just had like videotapes where we had to pay like $15 per an episode, and I was not gonna do. I think animated series had 2 episodes per tape, but still, that's a lot of fucking money, which I was not gonna spend just to watch this. So I never was able to watch the animated series until I was in my 20s, until the 2000s. And so during the 90s, this is always like a forbidden, hidden thing. I actually remember buying a book that had novel adaptations of them. And because I was curious and I started to read it, and I thought it was boring as hell. And this is one of the stories I was reading because I thought the concept of an underworlder world was very interesting. But in execution, it's not very... It's kind of boring. But it's okay. Not bad. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into the next episode, which is the slaver weapon. Now, I think I upgraded my opinion of this episode as well on my recent rewatch, because before I didn't have a very high opinion of this episode, because the aliens, as I said, these are the same. I can't remember what the hell they're called. They're like, not Zen-Kethy, that was one from Deep Space Nine, but something kind of like that. And they were name dropped in Picard, where Riker said, ooh, these aliens have been known to raid planets around here. Which is why he just gave him an excuse to go, shields up! Because, that's Riker, he has to say that. Anyway, but the aliens, the actual aliens themselves in this episode are so dumb. Like, they come off as extremely cartoonish, which granted, this is a cartoon, but still, as I said, there are other episodes in this show that aren't so ridiculous, but these are like flat out Hanna-Barbera characters. They're like these tigers that are like so dumb. They're sexist, and they I don't know, I almost seem like a prototype for the Ferengi for me, but they're just as goofy and stupid. And they try to, the episodes about them trying to have there's a supernatural artifact weapon that can, like, weapon of mass destruction from a race apparently called the Slavers, that existed, eons ago, whatever the fuck it was, and they find one of these relics, and Spock, Sulu, and Uhura team up to try to stop them. And these aliens were so dumb. Let me reinforce that. And I hated them. But I actually kind of like this episode going back and watching it, because I like that it's Spock, Sulu, and Uhura. That's one thing I do like about the animated series, is that it highlights some of these supporting characters more than the original series ever did. And this episode in particular really highlights Sulu and Uhura and gives them a chance to shine, instead of having the typical Kirk, Spock, McCoy every single fucking episode like the original series did. They switched it up. Kirk and McCoy are barely in this fucking episode, if they're in it at all. It's mainly Spock, and with the assistance of Sulu and Uhura. And Uhura actually has some really moments to shine in this episode, where she gets the better of them. And Sulu, actually, because they don't take Spock seriously because he's just a herbivore. It's like, you're just a grass-eating herbivore. We don't take you seriously. And that's part of the thing why I think these aliens are so fucking stupid, where I didn't buy them. But it did allow Sulu a lot more time to, like, be in command, and because he was the one who had to negotiate with these aliens, because they wouldn't talk to Spock. So I liked it for that reason, for the reason that Sulu and Uhura actually got a chance to shine, and we followed these supporting characters that we barely followed in the original series even more, and got to see them in their element and been doing good Starfleet stuff, even though the aliens in this episode were ridiculous and the plot with this supernatural weapon was kind of dumb. I still just like seeing Sulu and Uhura. So I upgraded this from being a bad episode to a decent one. It's okay. Alright, so then we get to the next episode, which is The Eye of the Beholder. Now, I remember I was watching on my rewatch, when I was watching this episode just recently, I got like maybe halfway through this episode, a quarter way through this episode, and I was like, what the hell is this episode? I don't remember this at all. Like there's this like starship that they were like chasing down. They were trying to find out what happened to the crew. They disappeared, and they go down to a planet and they find like these different like weird animals that keep attacking them. And there's like the generic pterodactyl things going, and like other generic monsters that go or whatever that keep attacking them. And they're going through and they find like different like terrains like right next to each other that shouldn't be next to each other. Like there's a desert next to a polar area next to a forest. And I was like, God, what the hell is this episode? I don't remember this episode at all. And then these like weird giant creatures like grab them and like carry them down on like what's happening, and they put them in the zoo, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, the zoo episode. Every episode of science fiction has to have an episode where their characters are placed in a zoo. I remember this happened a lot in the 70s and 80s. I don't remember what shows, I just remember maybe He-Man, I don't know. I remember it happening a lot. I remember more recently in the early 2000s is the Buzz Lightyear show, and they're coming out with a movie now for Buzz Lightyear. But anyway, it used to have a cartoon show that was on weekdays, and they got put in a zoo. And you know what? And I kept thinking, Star Trek doesn't really have a zoo episode, except for this one. This is the only really zoo episode. Now, you could count the cage, but I don't count the cage. Cage or menagerie doesn't really count, because sure, there are like other animals there, but it's not really an alien zoo. Like, this is a full-on like alien zoo where it's just like a zoo in real life, where where the humans are, and the different aliens come by and look at them and laugh at them. It's funny, the Spock is like, there seemed to be vibrating strangely, and they were actually just laughing at them. And of course, the Orville did a zoo episode, because they had to rip off every other sci-fi show. And when the Orville did a zoo episode, they're like, "Oh, they're just ripping off the cage." I'm like, but it's kind of different than the cage. No, it was a flat-out zoo episode, just like this one. So this is the only like really humans put in the zoo episode that Star Trek has, and it's all right. I found it kind of interesting. Of course, Michael Barrett does the voice of the woman officer, and I think James Doohan does the voice of the guy officer. But they, they one of them is dying, and McCoy had to use like thought, because apparently these aliens are telepathic, so to try to communicate, "I want my medical kit," and then they beam like one of the kids aboard the Enterprise, and it freaks out and carries Scotty around everywhere. It's a bit of a silly episode, but it's fine. It's a zoo episode. It's like what else would you want from a cartoon zoo episode? So this one's okay. So then we'll get into the next episode, which is The Jihad, which has a very I don't know, like, the whole Islamic terrorism thing was kind of around in the 70s, but the late 70s, I don't think it was as big of a deal. Especially watching when I first saw this episode, it was like 2005, and that was, all in the news, the jihad. But anyway, so I thought, what does this have to do with Islamic terrorism? And apparently nothing. It is this is basically the a generic Johnny Quest type. It's basically like a Dungeons and Dragons session put onto cartoon form, and they probably did this a lot. I don't know. Again, I haven't seen much cartoons in the 70s, but I can imagine shows like Johnny Quest and other shows where they basically, because it's a Dungeons and Dragon campaign. You got the different characters. You have the thief who's spineless and a coward. You got the muscle man who just wants to like kill shit, and you got this guy who's like can fly, a bird man, and you have this woman who's like good at like knocking shit over, and then you have Kirk and Spock. Now, so this episode is nothing. It's not really a Star Trek episode. I'm sorry. I don't like gatekeeping, but this isn't. It's a generic cartoon adventure episode. It really has nothing to do with Star Trek or Kirk and Spock. They're just chucked in there, kind of like a Simon Earth. They're just chucked in there so they could put it in a Star Trek show, and they're like, so they go on this quest to find this mythical weapon, and they have to go through all this trials and tribulation. They have to roll the dice to see who if they get double sixes or double ones, and the dungeon master will tell you what happens. And then the Birdman ends up being a traitor because why not? You know what? And when this episode, while I was watching this episode, I felt nothing. Like when they revealed the Birdman was a traitor, I'm like, oh, okay, who cares? And then they revealed that they, found the device, whatever, that was gonna save all of the universe. I was like, oh, who cares? Like, I felt no connection. It was just such a generic, like, Dungeons and Dragons thing, like, with just all these generic characters thrown in that you did not give a shit about. And Kirk and Spock felt kind of out of place. It felt nothing like a Star Trek episode. I was just so disconnected from everything. And then it had this weird Catwoman who, like, started the adventure and then came back and brought them back together. I guess she was the dungeon master, actually. Because she came in at the end and it was like, oh, you've completed your test. I can't remember if it was Module Barrett or Nichelle Nichols who did the voice for her, but one of them, of course. I think it might have been Nichelle Nichols this time, but anyway, they're not very good at voice acting. Oh, you completed your test. Anyway, and then they erased the memories of everyone involved, so they won't remember what happened. So what was the fucking point? I don't know. So, I mean, I didn't hate this episode, but it's really, my memory was erased after I watched it too. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is the Pirates of Orion! Sorry, I had to say Orion. Orion. Can you say it with me? Orion is not fucking Orion. Alright, now I actually do really like this episode. It may in fact be my favorite of the show. But God, it pisses me off the way every single character in this episode says Orion. It's fucking Orion. Like, and you notice the Orions from Journey to Babel. And at this stage was the only appearance of the Orions before this. But then, of course, after this, you get more appearance of the Orion Syndicate in Deep Space Nine, which weirdly doesn't actually feature any Orions. And then you had Enterprise, where they had the Orion Syndicate, and it did actually feature Orions. And then you had an Orion slave woman who were actually controlling the men in that episode Bond, which was a terrible episode, but that's Enterprise. Anywho, and then you got the Orion is a main cast member on Star Trek Lower Decks. And she's not a fucking Orion. It's a goddamn Orion. It's so irritating. Like, who was the genius? Was it like a director or someone who... It's a real fucking star. And it's quite a common award. Like, who's the idiot that looked at this and said, oh, I think it's pronounced Orion, so I'm going to make all of the actors pronounce it the same way as Orion. And it... Who was a moron who did this? Anyway, enough of that. I actually do like this episode, as I said. I think it was quite a powerful episode. It was about the Spock coming down with the disease, and they barely have enough time to get a cure. The Enterprise doesn't have enough time to get it itself, so they have a Federation transport delivered to them, but the transport is attacked by Orion pirates because the transport also had a bunch of dilithium, and they steal all the dilithium and the medicine. And then, of course, Kirk wants to hunt down the pirates, but the pirates want to keep their immunity which also goes along with Journey to Babel, not so much with Enterprise, but hey, that didn't come out for another 40 years. Anyway, so the the pirates are really, really freaked out about it becoming public that they are pirates, that because they're worried that Orion will lose its Orion, not fucking Orion, but they're worried that Orion will lose its neutrality if it's actually discovered and made public that they're pirates. So they'd rather die than be found out as pirates. And Kirk says, like, look, I don't give a shit about any of that. I just want that medicine. I want to save my first officer's life. You give me the medicine. I'll give you more. You can keep the dilithium you have. And plus, I will fucking give you more. And I'm not going to tell anyone about your neutrality. Whatever. You can keep it. I just want that freaking medicine to save Spock's life. That's it. And Kirk was being 100% sincere, and that's the true irony of this episode. And part of why I think it's so brilliant is that the Orions were so used to deception and being dastardly that they couldn't believe that Kirk was being honest, when in fact he was. And so they're like, he's fucking with us. He's actually going to give away our neutrality if we give him the medicine. So we're going to have to kill him. And the only way to do that is to kill ourselves, which is fine. We're willing to destroy our own ship in order to destroy his ship. And so they try to trick Kirk by having him beam down to this asteroid to exchange. But when Kirk shows up, he's like, well, actually, no, I'm going to kill you because I don't trust you. And so Kirk has to, beats the shit out of him, and they manage to stop the pirates from executing their plan, and they prevent them from self-destructing. And so they bring the leader of the pirates to their ship, and they capture him. They prevent him from doing his suicide capsule to kill himself. And then the other Orion ship was about to destroy itself rather than be given away. And Kirk has contacts and is like, look, we got your leader. We stopped him from killing himself. There's no point in you killing yourselves because you're already fucked. We already going to find out. We're already going to report that you are pirates, and you're already going to lose your neutrality, so you're going to kill yourselves for no goddamn reason. And the pirate leader is like, yes, listen to him. That's fine. Don't. And so they don't destroy themselves, but so they do capture the pirate, and they do expose them as being pirates, and the Orions do lose their neutrality. And I love the irony of that, because had these pirates actually just believed Kirk, if they had just listened to him, not only would they be able to keep their neutrality, and which is what was most important to them, they would have been able to get away with all that dilithium plus more that they stole. So I love the irony of that, because they're so unscrupulous themselves, they couldn't possibly believe that Starfleet captain would be telling the truth when he was. And I love that. There's some rich irony in that. And plus, I just thought the episode was really intense. It really held my suspense. It was suspenseful. It held my attention because I really felt like Spock's life hanged on the thread, and then Kirk was so desperate to get that medicine, and he didn't care how he had to do it. If he had to bargain with the Orions, and let them keep the dilithium, so be it. The only thing that mattered to him was saving Spock's life. But if he needed to kick the Orions' ass, the Orions, if he needed to kick the Orions' ass and expose them, then he would do that too. It's the only thing that mattered was Spock's life, and that was powerful. So yeah, I did really like this episode, although I'm not giving it a 9 out of 10. It still only gets an 8 out of 10 because they keep saying Orion. Stop saying Orion. Anyway, we'll get into the next episode, which is Bem, I'm into season 2 now. Not that it matters. I think the Pirates of the Orions was the first episode of season 2, and this is the second one. Bim. This is the one I was talking about. I had that colony creature who can split himself into 3 pieces, and they had a member of the species appear on lower decks. I hate this episode. I hate this character. I hate. Like, he's such a moron. He does all this stupid shit and he gets the Kirk and Spock into trouble. And there's like these, they're there on this planet with these primitive aliens who they said, oh, there's a prime directive, we're not allowed to interfere. Then why the fuck are you there? Like, you shouldn't be there. Like, I suppose, you could say Starfleet Federation would later have those duck blinds or whatever where they have those holographic things, hidden things, but they don't. Like, Kirk and Spock are just freely walking around where they could be exposed to this primitive culture. So I'm like, well, why are you doing this? And then, of course, that Bim guy just runs off and gets himself captured on purpose because he's a fucking moron. And then he criticizes Kirk and Spock for not being able to rescue him when he could have helped them the whole time. Like, I just want to strangle this guy at many points of the episode. But where it really gets me is they have this powerful entity being who is like, do not touch my children, who's very obviously Nichelle Nichols. Like, it just sounds like a horror. I'm sorry, she cannot do other voices, but she's kind of trying to be like Gaia from Captain Planet or something, where like, do not touch my children, and they like still, makes Kirk's weapons disappear, and Kirk and Spock are like trapped there, and eventually, oh my god, I fucking hate this scene where Kirk gets a communicator and he tries to contact the alien, and it's like, Kirk to entity, Kirk to entity, instead of saying Enterprise, he says entity, and it says that several times. It's so fucking stupid. But anyway, he calls the entity and it's like, look, we just want to leave, just give us the communicators, let us contact the Enterprise, and we'll leave. And she's like, okay, I want you away from my children, so good, contact your ship. So Kirk contacts the ship, and the first thing he does is says, Scotty, bring down an armed security team. I'm like, Kirk, what the fuck are you doing? She just told you gave you permission, like, let her powers who was stopping you from leaving and has the power to, like, make your weapons disappear. And she said, gives you permission to go back to your ship, and the first thing you do is bring more people down. Like, what the hell is wrong with you? And the first thing when Scotty and the security team show up, they just start shooting the fucking natives that the entity was like trying so desperately to protect. I'm like, what? This is like the biggest fuck up. Like, everyone is fucking up in this episode so terribly. But, Kirk, his excuse was that, they couldn't leave without Bim, and said they needed to beam down all the securities and, like, phase the fucking natives that this entity was so desperate to protect and not interfere with, because they needed to find Bim, and once they found Bim, then they could go. And so they found Bim, and Bim was like, oh, I'm so terrible, I'm just going to kill myself because I fucked up so badly. And I'm like, you probably should, actually. But then Kirk's like, no, we can't have you do that. You need to, what a drama queen, too. But anyway, so the entity's like, oh, yes, you can go in peace with my thanks. I'm like, why are you thanking Kirk? He's this fucking moron that brought a bunch of armed men that started shooting your children. Like, I hate this episode. I just hate it. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is The Practical Joker, which is so dumb. It's another episode I really don't like. It's so stupid. I think when I reviewed this originally, I thought, oh, this episode's actually kind of... Again, there's like... It's actually funny, and it tended to be funny, but it's funny because it's stupid. Like, some weird cloud thing gets stuck on the Enterprise computer and turns into a practical joker, where it keeps running practical jokes on the crew. Like, it's so dumb, but of course I do love when Kirk's uniform says Kirk is a jerk. That's the only thing I thought was funny. But other than that, like all this like stupid childish shit, like making Spock look into this thing, and it just gives him black rings around his eyes, and everyone's like ho 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 and laughing at him. And then like the people go into the holodeck. This is the episode with the holodeck, and McCoy and Uhura in the middle of this crisis, like, oh, let's just fuck off to a holodeck, and they go in there, and of course the Practical Joker, the ship's computer, like traps them in this hole and makes them fall down, and then they're stuck there, and then it makes the holodeck turn into a polar ice cap, like freezing area, and they're stuck and can't get out of it, and they could freeze to death, and the computer's just laughing at them. It's no longer just a Practical Joker now, it's like a fucking masochist, like cruel torture device. But whatever. Eventually Kirk like talks the computer into going back into the nebula, which he knows would get rid of the Practical Joker thing, by saying, oh no, don't go back to the nebula, anything but that. And the way he says it, I'm like, it's such a terrible delivery. Fucking hate William Shatner's acting. And not all the time, but I don't know, what a stupid episode. I don't like it. Anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is Albatross. Now, I actually do like this episode because I was surprised when I first watched it. I was like, well, this is just going to be another wrongfully accused episode. Like, we don't have enough of those already. But it was actually more than that, because they go to this alien world, and they're beaming that they're down there, like Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and they're like, oh, thank you for coming in, we're your heroes, and they're all happy. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, and by the way, your chief medical officer is under arrest for genocide. And this is the way they just bring it up on them like that. It's like, what the fuck? Anyway, so they're accusing McCoy of spreading this disease that killed a bunch of people, which of course you know is horseshit. And McCoy himself, of course, I think it's very in character, because he was like, well, what if I did do this unwillingly? What if I accidentally did start this virus that killed a bunch of people, and the aliens are being assholes to him, but Kirk is off on an adventure to try to clear McCoy's name, because of course he knows McCoy's innocent, and this other alien investigator is trying to stop them from doing it, and he goes along with them, and they go to this planet, but they end up catching that same disease. And then the crew is like dying, and they try to go back to the planet. It's like, we need McCoy to save us, and it's like, oh, this is just a trick. So Spock, and of course Spock's Vulcan, not affected. Of course, he's always impervious to any disease apparently. But anyway, he beams down and breaks McCoy out of prison. I love how McCoy's like, I don't want to go. I want to face this trial. You're breaking the law. And Spock's like, well, if you don't come, anyone in the Enterprise is going to die. And it's like, wow, why didn't you just tell me that? And Spock's like, well, I tried, but you didn't give me any time. It's some Spock McCoy interactions I actually like. A lot, most of it in the animated series, I think, is actually quite terrible. It's just them, like, McCoy being a flat-out racist. But this was actually very interesting. And so, they beam McCoy back, and he finds the cure with Spock's help, and he cures everyone. And then they, in doing so, they deduce that it was like some comet or something that comes every 7 years that calls the disease, and not McCoy, so his name is cleared in the process. So yeah, I actually kind of like this episode. It turned out to be more than just another wrongfully accused episode, and there was a lot more to it, and I thought the character stories involved with McCoy was actually good. So there you go. Alright, so then we're gonna move over to the next episode, which is How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth. I think this is the one that won an Emmy. This is a celebrated episode that features a Native American crew member, Walking Bear, and one of the writers on this episode was a Native American, and it features the Kukulkan, which is, I believe, a god in Mayan culture. I mean, there's all sorts of Norse gods, Greek gods, all sorts of other mythologies show up, so why not Mayan as well? But I don't really like this episode as much as praise it gets for its, including Native American culture, which I'm all for. It's just another, like, alien being a dick to the ship, being like, oh, blah, blah, and using your same generic noises that keeps, like, being a dick to the Enterprise. It is kind of boring, and I'm kind of sick of it. So, I'm sorry. I don't really think this episode's that good. I don't think it's terrible, but there it is. Anyway, so next we will get into what I believe is the final episode of the animated series, The Counterclock Incident. And this features Robert April, who is not black. And so everyone freaked out when Stranger New Worlds aired, and then Robert April was played by a black actor. And they're like, oh, but he was white in the animated series. But again, animated series, on the canon show, I don't give a fuck. He can be black. I don't give a shit. That's so dumb when people make it, especially about Robert April. Who gives a fuck? But anyway, that's another topic, I suppose. So, Robert April, who was talked about in lore by Gene Roddenberry, actually, this is his only appearance before Strange New Worlds just came out. And canon, if you consider this canon. And he's like an old dude, and they're chasing this ship, and the woman's like, they're trying to communicate with her, but she's talking backwards, and they follow her. They're trying to rescue her, which I think they are being kind of dumb, because obviously doesn't want to be rescued. And it turns out that those are only way to get back to her own universe, and they accidentally sucked the Enterprise into this universe, and it's a backward universe, and now she's talking forward, and the ship is like moving backwards, and time is moving backwards, and the crew start growing younger, and they have to come up with a plan to get back to the right universe, but the crew is growing very young very fast, and so it gets to the point where they're too young to command the ship. But Robert April, who was super old, is now in his prime, and so he's able to command the ship with Spock, who's like a teenager, but still, because he's the Vulcan, he's like awesome and impervious or whatever. and they managed to get the ship back, and then Robert April and his wife, they figured out they can use the transporter to revert all of the children back to their rightful age. And so Robert April and his wife is like, well, we don't need to do that. We can stay young in our prime and live our lives again. And Robert April is like, no, I would only do that if I was unhappy with how my life played out. But I am happy with how my life played out, so there's no reason to go through it again. And they do sound exactly fucking like that. That's how James Doohan talks. But anyway... I did a spot-on impression. But anyway, that's stupid. They wouldn't fucking do that. I don't buy that for a second. No one in their right mind would be like, oh, I'm happy with how my life is. No, everyone and their fucking mother would be like, hell yeah! I'm young again. Fuck yes. I'm going to get to live again. I'm not going to have to face death, who's lurking around the corner at any second. Now I'm in my prime, healthy, I'm young. Fuck yeah. No one's going to turn that down. I don't buy that bullshit. I'm sorry. Don't. Absolutely do not. And also, I haven't mentioned it yet, but there were several episodes in the animated series, not just this one, where the transporter is a magical device that can solve all the problems. They used this in a couple of TNG episodes, and people complained about it. I think, what was that one where, like, Pulaski was old? They used the transporter to revert her back to her right age. And then there was one with Picard where he would, like, beam down the cloud, but he just beamed back the way he was before. And that actually started here with the animated series. They used the transporter as a be-all, end-all magical device that could solve all your problems. That started here, folks. They did that several times. But anyway, I actually liked this episode. Again, it was the whole talking backwards thing. The backward universe was interesting. I don't really get why the crew was aging or de-aging so goddamn fast, though. Shouldn't they be de-aging at the same rate that we age forward, which means it would take them like decades to get that young? But I don't know, then that episode wouldn't be as interesting, I guess. I don't know. But it's okay. Like I still like this episode. It still has this, it's still interesting, it's still engaging. So yeah, decent episode. So that is it for all of the episodes of Season 1 and 2 of Star Trek the Animated Series. And now, as always, I will name my favorite and least favorite episode of the seasons. For worst episode, you have contenders like Bem, the Infinite Vulcan, the Mud's Passion, the Practical Joker, Once Upon a Planet. But for the worst episode of the animated series, I'm actually going to go with The Magics of Omega 2. This episode was ridiculous, farcical, nonsensical, and just a bunch of garbage. These demon aliens show up and they're like, oh, we're going to put you on the Salem witch trial. Hey, the Salem witch trial was just people using a bullshit excuse to kill other women that they didn't like. That's all that was. It wasn't actually aliens using magic. But whatever. So what a terrible episode. Now, as for the best episode, my favorite episode of the show, with their contenders for this is Yesteryear, the Lelori Signal, The Survivor, and Albatross. But as for the best episode of the show, I am going to go with the Pirates of Orion. Orion! Anyway, despite their terrible pronunciation in this episode, it was really good. It was the most intense. It's the one that to me felt the most like an actual live action episode of Star Trek. It used the animation though to its advantage by having the weird Orions and the ships, and we actually got to see them. We didn't really get to see them other in the disguise of an Andorian before this episode, and I love the irony of it. I love how if they simply trusted Kirk, they would have got their way, but because they couldn't do that, they ended up being completely fucked. I love that. I love it. So this is my favorite episode of the animated series. Now, for my rating out of 10 for Star Trek the Animated Series Seasons 1 and 2, I'm going to give this a 5 average. That does make it lower than any of the other seasons for the original series. It's not terrible, but all my complaints about how the animation's terrible, how they just sit there, they're very stilted and they just move their eyes back and forth, or they run like this with their shoulders or run at the camera. So animation's terrible. They're stilted. They have the voice acting is for the most part terrible. They're very recognizable. I'm sorry. I love the cast of the original series, but they're not professional voice actors. They are not very good at doing other voices. You can tell that's James Doohan, or that's George Takei, or that's fucking Nigel Barrett. They all sound like fucking Nurse Chapel. And most of the episodes are kind of dull, kind of boring. Now, as I said, there are some good ones in there, but nothing that really blows my socks off. So it's not terrible. I'm not going to say this is a bad show overall, but average. It's 5. That's what it gets. So anyway, that is it for my review of Star Trek the Animated Series Seasons 1 and 2. So next month, prepare yourselves, because I will be doing the top 15 worst episodes of the original and the animated series, and my top 30 best episodes of the original and the animated series combined. Woo! Honestly, there are probably going to be more animated series episodes in my worst list, but we'll see. I haven't made the list yet. We'll see how it stacks up. So, that's coming next month. In the meantime, you can check out my channel for many more Star Trek reviews and reviews on other shows, such as Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Better Call Saul, The Expanse, Star Wars Rebels, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.